June 19th, 1984. Fernald, Ohio. 39-year-old Dave Bocks shows up to work the overnight shift at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, a plant which processes uranium for nuclear weapons. Dave vanishes before his shift ends, and evidence soon emerges that he fell into some molten liquid inside one of the plant's furnaces. While the authorities initially suspect that Dave committed suicide, the plant is soon hit with a major scandal involving radioactive contamination, leading to speculation that Dave was murdered for threatening to blow the whistle on his workplace's unsafe practices. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to the latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering one of my most in-demand unsolved mysteries cases, the 1984 death of Dave Bocks. As you can imagine, I've received a ton of requests to cover this story since the inception of the podcast, as it's one of the more harrowing cases unsolved mysteries ever presented. It involves a man named Dave Bocks, who vanished while working the graveyard shift at a plant which processed nuclear material, though the general public was not aware of that fact at the time. Bone fragments and personal items belonging to Dave were soon found inside the molten liquid of one of the plant's furnaces, meaning that he suffered one of the most horrifying deaths imaginable. While there was no direct evidence that foul play had taken place, there were some odd discrepancies surrounding Dave's death, and suspicion would escalate after his workplace was implicated in a massive scandal just a few months later. Naturally, rumors started circulating that a cover-up had taken place, and Dave was murdered and dumped inside the furnace because he was a potential whistleblower about some of the unsavory things taking place at the plant. For the longest time, I was 100% certain that Dave Bocks was a victim of foul play, but all things considered, there is surprisingly little information out there about his death, besides the Unsolved Mystery segment, so I've started looking at the case in a bit of a different light in recent years. But I'll go into more detail about that later on in this episode. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, which may include stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the mysterious death of Dave Bocks. Our story begins in 1984 in Fernald, Ohio, a small farming community located in Hamilton County, about 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati. Our central figure is 39-year-old Dave Bocks, who hails from the town of Loveland, nearly 30 miles away. Dave has 2 teenage sons and a teenage daughter, and has been divorced for the past 5 years, but while he is currently living alone, he remains close with his ex-wife and children. He is employed at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, which is more commonly referred to as NLO, an abbreviation for the National Lead Company of Ohio. NLO holds the contract to manage and operate the 1,050-acre facility, which consists of 9 separate specialized plants. But unbeknownst to the general public, the facility is actually owned by the Department of Energy. It began its operations in 1951, and one of the reasons it was named the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center is because its primary function was to produce and process high-grade uranium fuel cores, which were considered to be feed for nuclear weapons and reactors. Whenever anyone was hired by NLO, they were told to keep this piece of information secret, but were assured that the facility was a low-level radiation plant which posed no health risks to them or the surrounding community. Dave Bocks' employment with NLO began in 1981 when he was hired as a pipe fitter for their maintenance department. His responsibilities involved inspecting and maintaining the equipment throughout all of the different plants, including the safety pumps and dust collectors used to process uranium. Dave was assigned to work the graveyard shift as the plant's production lines were shut down, giving the maintenance crews full reign of the facility. Since he lived over 35 minutes away, it was common practice for Dave to carpool with one of his co-workers, Harry Easterling, as they met in the parking lot of a local restaurant and took turns driving each other's vehicles to the plant for their shifts. At around 11 p.m. on the evening of June 18th, Dave and Harry met at the restaurant per usual, and Harry drove them both to work in his truck. They worked in separate areas of the plant, and their shifts officially began at midnight on June the 19th, before ending at 8:30 a.m. that morning. According to Harry, after they arrived at the plant, they reported to the maintenance room, where Dave unlocked his toolbox and left his keys and the padlock in the top level of the box. Dave and Harry were each given their separate assignments, and Dave was assigned to look at a pump in Plant 8, the scrap recovery plant. The two men went their separate ways, and Harry worked his shift like normal until he attended a safety meeting inside the conference room in Plant 4 at 7 a.m. To Harry's surprise, Dave did not show up for the meeting as expected. When his shift ended at 8:30, Harry went to the maintenance room and noticed that Dave's toolbox was still open and his keys were still resting inside. Harry wondered if Dave was deciding to stay longer to work some overtime, but after calling around the plant, he could not locate him. Harry decided to leave and asked the security guard to let Dave know he had gone home and would meet him in the restaurant parking lot for their shift later that night. Indeed, Harry did show up at the restaurant as planned at 11 p.m. on the evening of June 19th and saw that Dave's car was parked there. At first, Harry thought Dave might have gone inside to grab some food, but he did not come out, and it wasn't long before Harry noticed that the hood on the car was cold, suggesting that it had remained parked in the same spot since the previous night. When Harry drove to the plant and still could not locate Dave, he contacted security and reported him missing. This prompted them to pry open Dave's locker, and Harry saw that the street clothes Dave had changed out of at the start of his previous shift were still in there. And even though Dave had clocked in for his shift at midnight, there was no record of him ever having clocked out. An investigation was launched, and it would turn out that the last confirmed sighting of Dave was from an employee who saw him at around 5 a.m. on the morning of the 19th. The employee said Dave was heading in the direction of Plant 4, known as the Green Salt Plant, since it produced uranium tetrafluoride, but he found this unusual since Dave had been assigned to work in Plant 8 on that particular shift. Well, shortly after Dave was last seen, an odd occurrence took place in Plant 6, the metals fabrication plant, which housed a uranium processing furnace which was 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. Uranium ingots would be lowered into molten salt inside the furnace, which was kept at a constant temperature of 1300 degrees Fahrenheit before they were converted into rods. While the furnace was generally not used during the graveyard shift, it was always left on and kept at the same temperature. However, at 5:15 a.m., there was a sudden drop of 28 degrees, which only lasted for a few seconds, suggesting that something foreign had been dumped into the molten liquid. But that wasn't the only weird occurrence around the furnace that morning. At around 7:30, one of the furnace operators told his supervisor that he was noticing a strange odor and that the casings in his oven seemed to be covered with a sticky residue. He also thought he saw something which looked like a leg inside the molten salt, but when the supervisor took a look, he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. While following the news of Dave's disappearance, these events suddenly became a lot more concerning, as there was a gap between the hood of the furnace and the oven, which was large enough for a person to fit through. On June 20th, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department were notified about what was going on, and they ordered the furnace to be shut down. But since the molten liquid was so hot, it would be 3 days before a search could be conducted. During this time period, the sheriff's department found what appeared to be a piece of bone on the lip of the furnace, causing everyone to fear the worst. When the molten salt finally cooled off, police and employees started breaking it down and sifting through the waste material found inside the furnace. They wound up finding some horribly burned items, including a set of keys, a steel toe from a boot, fragments from a walkie-talkie, and part of an eyeglass frame which seemed to match the glasses Dave wore. Curiously, they also found some stainless steel wire that was looped together in 3 oddly connecting circles, but most disturbingly, they also discovered some more fragments of human bone. It turned out the set of keys were a match for Dave's car and some of the padlocks from his toolbox, and while this particular key was too bent to test for certain, one of them seemed to match his residence. This pretty much made it a certainty that Dave had somehow fallen to his death into the molten liquid. Well, believe it or not, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department initially suggested the possibility that Dave entered the furnace on his own to commit suicide. He had a history of psychological problems, and 5 years earlier, around the time of his divorce, Dave did make an attempt to take his own life. However, his friends and family did not buy this theory because none of Dave's behavior prior to his death suggested he was depressed or suicidal. Earlier that week, he had purchased groceries and paid his bills for the month, and he had also been talking with his children about organizing a summer vacation to Florida. In fact, while they were driving to the plant together for Dave's final shift, Harry Easterling claimed that Dave talked about this vacation and even showed him a new lunchbox he had just purchased, so he saw no signs that Dave was planning to take his own life. Harry had also noticed an odd discrepancy, which made him believe that someone else had to be involved with Dave's death. Like I just mentioned, a set of keys belonging to Dave were found inside the furnace, but you might recall that Dave left some keys inside his toolbox when he began his shift, and Harry was certain they were still there when the shift ended at 8:30 a.m. In fact, when he showed up for his next shift later that evening, Harry claimed the keys were still inside Dave's toolbox. After a supervisor was informed, he took Dave's keys, but Harry said this was the last time he ever saw them. The sudden drop in the furnace's temperature at 5:15 a.m. on June the 19th was an indication that Dave's body went in there at that exact moment, but the discrepancy with the keys suggested that someone tossed them in there at a later time. There would also be an odd story from the same employee who last saw Dave alive at 5 a.m. that morning. He claimed that around 1 hour earlier, he saw Dave and one of his supervisors speaking inside a parked pickup truck on the factory grounds. Even though it was a hot and muggy night, the windows were rolled up, but the employee said it looked like Dave and the supervisor were in the midst of a serious discussion, though he couldn't make out what they were saying. Nevertheless, the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department could not find any evidence that Dave had been a victim of foul play. Even though there was generally a 5-year waiting period between when a missing person could be declared legally dead, Dave's family filed suit in Hamilton County Probate Court to have him declared dead in order to collect his estate and benefits. DNA testing had not come into effect yet, so they could not conclusively prove that the bone fragments found in the furnace belonged to Dave, but his family believed there was ample evidence that his body had been completely incinerated in there. The probate court ultimately agreed and legally declared Dave dead in March of 1986, but in a cruel postscript, his family could not even give him a proper burial. All that was left of Dave were a few bone fragments, but the remains were considered too toxic to be buried in the ground, so they wound up being sealed in a drum and stored at a Nevada nuclear test site alongside other radioactive materials. In December of 1984, only 6 months after Dave was killed, NLO would find itself at the center of controversy when it was announced that 300 pounds of enriched uranium oxide had been released into the atmosphere, largely because of a broken dust collector which had gone undetected for the past 3 months. For the first time, the public finally learned that the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center was owned by the Department of Energy and had been processing uranium and nuclear material. A subsequent investigation would reveal that over the course of the past 3 decades, the plant had released over 200 tons of radioactive dust particles into the air and local water sources. When the plant was originally built in 1951, there were no provisions made for the disposal of solid radioactive waste, so a pit was dug in which to store it, even though there were numerous warnings that this could contaminate the local water supply. These pits often stored wastewater containing uranium emissions and other radioactive materials, but whenever it rained, the pits would overflow. In addition, the plant also had 4 large storage tanks which had stored thousands of pounds of radioactive waste, some of which was left over from the Manhattan Project in World War II. Well, at some point, one of these tanks developed cracks in its concrete wall, which would allow radioactive liquid to leak from it, but rather than spend the money to repair it, the Department of Energy's solution was simply to tell everyone to make sure the liquid stayed beneath the cracks. Documents would show that the Department of Energy knew all about these issues for quite some time, but did nothing to stop it, and often ordered NLO to continue production without regard for environmental laws. And they would not provide the plant with adequate resources to curtail these problems, as one former manager would state that they were only given enough funding to keep the plant barely functional. In 1986, control of the plant was transferred from NLO to the Westinghouse Materials Company of Ohio, but the problems had already escalated as it became apparent that their unsafe practices had left a devastating impact on the community, causing a number of local residents to develop cancer and other serious illnesses. An organization called Fernald Residents for Environmental Safety and Health filed a $300 million class action lawsuit against NLO and the Department of Energy on behalf of 14,000 people who worked or lived near the plant. They eventually reached a settlement which paid out $78 million to local residents for emotional distress and loss of property values, $20 million to NLL workers for health and safety claims, and $14 million to the state of Ohio for environmental damage. Things reached the point where even the state governor was demanding that the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center be permanently closed, and it was finally shut down for good in 1989. Needless to say, these revelations sparked theories that Dave Bocks' death was a cover-up, and that he was murdered because he was planning to blow the whistle on all the unsafe practices taking place at the plant. It turned out that Plant 8, the scrap recovery plant where Dave was usually assigned to work, had released 4 times more radioactive contaminants into the environment than any of the other plants on site. One of Dave's responsibilities involved inspecting and maintaining dust collectors, and it was a broken dust collector which had allowed uranium to be released into the atmosphere in 1984 and led to the scandal causing the plant's ultimate downfall. In March of 1994, the case was featured on an episode of Unsolved Mysteries, which featured interviews with Harry Easterling, Dave's daughter Casey, and an investigative reporter named D.C. Cole. Cole expressed his belief that Dave was murdered during his final shift because he was a potential whistleblower about what was happening at the plant. Whoever was responsible bound Dave with the stainless steel wire found in the furnace before lowering his body inside. But in spite of this new exposure on national television, no evidence was ever found to support these allegations. Anyway, following the closing of the plant, a massive environmental cleanup operation called the Fernald Closure Project would be launched. In total, the project would cost $4.4 billion and was not completed until 2006. The contaminated site has now been turned into a nature preserve, though it is still considered to be unfit for human habitation and will have to be closely monitored for decades. In 2013, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health performed a study of 6,409 workers who had worked at the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center and found a high rate of cancer and serious illnesses among them, most likely due to the high levels of radiation they were exposed to during their employment. But while suspicion continues to surround Dave Bocks' death, the actual circumstances of how he wound up in the furnace continue to remain unknown. So I guess you could say, the trail went cold. But before we continue, I'd like to take a few moments to recommend another podcast. If you're a fan of The Trail Went Cold, you probably enjoy in-depth coverage of all things true crime. So I'd like to tell you about a podcast that explores some of the biggest and most well-known cases in the history of true crime, but also introduces listeners to some of the most bizarre, yet lesser-known cases out there. That podcast is Criminology. Criminology brings you in-depth analysis and discussion for the cases they cover. Hosts Mike Morford and Mike Ferguson include interviews with experts and investigators to make you feel like you yourself are part of the investigation. They also interview victims, survivors, and witnesses so that you get the scoop directly from the people involved with these cases. Criminology has tackled infamous and legendary cases, including the Zodiac and Golden State Killer, but they've also explored puzzling and shocking cases you probably haven't heard of, like the Pocatello babysitter murders, in which several babysitters were killed in Pocatello, Idaho, or the case of the Hatchet murders in room 260, where a couple was killed inside a hotel that was hosting a morticians convention. And just like I do on The Trail Went Cold, Criminology also occasionally covers memorable cases from unsolved mysteries. On Criminology, you'll hear about both solved and unsolved cases, which includes everything from missing persons to serial killers to cold cases to the cases that are still in the headlines. So give Criminology a try today. They're bound to have an episode that interests you. Search for Criminology wherever you listen to podcasts, and be sure to subscribe today so you don't miss an episode. Thank you, and enjoy the rest of our show. Well, needless to say, most Unsolved Mysteries fans often rank the segment about this case as one of the most frightening ever featured on the show. There's one particular moment which usually sends a chill down everyone's spine. It's a reenactment which shows Dave Bocks' body hanging upside down from some sort of crane as he's slowly lowered into the furnace, and DC Cole's voice is heard on the soundtrack stating, quote, "The question I have is whether or not Dave Bocks was alive at the time that they threw him into that furnace. I would hate to think that he was conscious. I can't imagine a more horrible death than that." End quote. Yeah, I definitely say that being lowered to your death inside a furnace containing 1300-degree molten liquid is the stuff nightmares are made of. This is generally the biggest argument people use against the idea that Dave committed suicide. No matter how horrible your state of mind might be at that time, could you really reach the point where you'd be willing to take your own life in such a horrific fashion? For many years, if you ever asked me about this case, I would say there was zero doubt Dave was murdered and that there was a massive cover-up involved. But as time has gone by, I've learned to look at this case a bit differently. I mean, while the authorities couldn't find any direct evidence of foul play, that probably isn't too surprising, given that a 1300-degree furnace is going to do a pretty effective job of destroying said evidence. But I can definitely see why people would be willing to assume the worst, given that a massive scandal surrounding the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center broke out only a few months after Dave was killed. It's clear that the Department of Energy had spent decades ordering them to continue practices which they knew to be unsafe and pose serious health risks to the workers, the surrounding community, and the environment. You could probably put together an entire long-form podcast about this whole scandal, and I can't imagine how horrifying it must have been for the residents of Fernald to learn that they were unknowingly living near a plant which handled uranium and other radioactive materials. One of the most harrowing side stories in this whole affair involved a local resident named Charles Zinser, who started growing a vegetable garden about a half-mile from the plant in early 1984. Zinser often took his 2 sons to his garden while he tended to it, but within 2 years, the eldest boy, who was 8, wound up being diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and the youngest, who was only 3, had the lower part of his left leg amputated when traces of uranium were found in his tissue. There are many other cases just like this of Fernald residents developing serious health issues, so it is tempting to believe that Dave Bocks was murdered because he threatened to blow the whistle on the whole thing. But here's the main reason I've started looking at this case in a different light. I have researched so many cases from Unsolved Mysteries for this podcast over the past 3.5 years that it bothers me when I can't find much information from outside sources. If you search online, you'll find no shortage of information about the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center and their scandal, but there's surprisingly not much out there about the death of Dave Bocks. Yes, you can find a number of local newspaper articles from 1984 which reported on his death, but as far as conspiracy theories involving foul play, it seems like the primary source is Unsolved Mysteries. Let's make a comparison here. Many of you are probably familiar with the story of Karen Silkwood, who was an employee at a nuclear fuel production facility in Oklahoma and became a whistleblower in 1974 after discovering that her working conditions were unsafe and that she had been contaminated with plutonium. Silkwood was about to go public with this information and was literally on her way to provide materials to a journalist from the New York Times when she was killed in a mysterious car crash. Of course, there's no shortage of conspiracy theories surrounding Silkwood's death, and they even made an Academy Award-nominated movie about her story starring Meryl Streep. Given that there seem to be similarities between their two stories, why is there so much information out there about Karen Silkwood, but very little about Dave Bocks? Well, for starters, we don't even know for sure if Bocks was a whistleblower and even knew about the unsavory practices taking place at his plant, as that's all pure speculation. It seems that the main proponent of this theory is D.C. Cole, the quote-unquote investigative reporter who was interviewed on Unsolved Mysteries, and I use that term pretty loosely. Cole comes across as a really colorful character during his interview, as he speaks in a southern accent, sports a beard and a ponytail, and is dressed in a turtleneck and sports jacket combination. But the main problem is that when you attempt to do an online search about D.C. Cole, there really isn't much out there about him. It looks like he did publish a book about this case in 1998 titled Bocks Conspiracy, but it doesn't seem to be available anywhere, and I can't find any information about his journalistic credentials or how he got involved in the Dave Bocks case to begin with. There's a big difference between Karen Silkwood's story drawing the interest of the New York Times and this case drawing the interest of some dude named D.C. Cole. All the major media outlets did stories about the scandal surrounding the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center, so why didn't any of them delve further into Dave Bocks' death? Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying there isn't good reason to be suspicious of the circumstances of how Dave was killed, but I want to look at the whole thing objectively and maintain a level of skepticism about certain details. The one thing we do know is that it seems very likely that Dave's exact time of death was around 5:15 a.m. on the morning of June 19th, because this is when there was a sudden 28-degree drop in the temperature inside the furnace, which likely only would have occurred if something large like a human body wound up in there. Now, one of the biggest reasons people were skeptical about Dave's death being a suicide was that it took place over 5 hours into his shift. Of course, I've studied enough suicide cases to know that the actions of a person who decide to take their own life can often be completely unpredictable and sometimes defy all logic. One of the reasons investigators thought it was possible that Dave committed suicide was because he had a history of psychological problems and had already made one previous attempt to take his own life during the time period he was going through a divorce. I know this incident took place 5 years earlier, and Dave's family and friends have stated that he showed no signs of being suicidal prior to his death, as he did a number of things to suggest he was preparing for the future, such as planning a vacation to Florida with his kids. And of course, if Dave had been planning to take his own life, why did he even bother showing up at the plant to work the majority of his shift before he did so? Did he spend that time mentally preparing himself, or did something just suddenly set him off? Again, suicidal people can often be very unpredictable, which is why their actions sometimes catch people by complete surprise, but it's worth reiterating that a person would have to be in a pretty dark place before they decided to jump into a 1,300-degree furnace. If Dave had not attempted to take his own life in the past, would the police have even entertained the suicide theory? In their defense, since most of the evidence was completely incinerated, it's not like the police had anything to point to one theory in particular, and without any direct proof of foul play, they may have thought that suicide was the most logical conclusion. While I have my doubts that Dave willingly jumped into the furnace on his own and killed himself, what surprises me is that the big debate between both sides in this case has always seemed to be murder versus suicide, and there's never been much discussion about the possibility that Dave's death was an accident. From what I've read, the only way to enter the furnace was through a gap between the hood and the oven, and if a person climbed onto some pipes above it, they theoretically could have fallen in accidentally. Now you'd think that most plants would have safeguards in place to prevent one of their workers from falling into a 1300-degree furnace, particularly since the production lines were shut down during the graveyard shift, and it sounds like no one even used the furnace during those hours. But as you well know, this plant did not consider employees' safety to be its top priority. Given that this was the graveyard shift, it's not implausible that Dave could have entered Plant 6 alone to do some work in there while the building was completely empty and accidentally fallen into the furnace without anyone seeing it. But the big question is, would he have had any reason to go in there on his own? The last employee known to have seen Dave alive claimed that he was heading for Plant 4 at around 5 a.m., even though Dave was assigned to work inside Plant 8 that night. So how did Dave wind up in Plant 6? Given that the drop in the furnace's temperature occurred at 5:15, the implication seems to be that something pretty major happened during that 15-minute window. Dave's job involved inspecting and maintaining equipment, but without knowing much about his specific work assignments, I have no idea if it was common practice for him to look at the equipment in Plant 6. Now, the theory presented by D.C. Cole on Unsolved Mysteries is that Dave was killed or incapacitated by someone at another location, and this person or persons subsequently transported his body into Plant 6 in order to dispose of it in the furnace. Theoretically, this could have happened shortly after Dave arrived at Plant 4, but from what I've read, that particular plant had about a dozen of their own furnaces, which were used for the conversion of uranium trioxide to uranium tetrafluoride. Granted, I don't know how large these furnaces were, and if they would have been adequate enough to destroy a human body, but I also think that if Dave was killed inside Plant 4, it may have been quite risky to transport his body to Plant 6. It's hard to imagine how these events would have unfolded during a narrow 15-minute time frame, but on the other hand, it's also a pretty narrow time frame for Dave to have traveled from Plant 4 to Plant 6 and subsequently climbed up to the pipes above the furnace before he fell in. When you look at all the available information about this case, it seems that there are three pieces of evidence which are used to support the theory that foul play took place. The eyewitness account of Dave having a conversation with his supervisor, Harry Easterling seeing Dave's keys inside his toolbox hours after he was supposedly killed, and the stainless steel wire found inside the furnace, which was looped together into 3 circles. As you'll recall, an employee claimed he saw Dave and a supervisor having a conversation inside a pickup truck with the windows rolled up at 4 a.m., just over an hour before Dave was killed. And this is definitely the most frustrating aspect of this case to me, because the details are so vague. I'd really like to think that police interviewed this supervisor and learned what the conversation with Dave was about, but unfortunately, I have no idea if this occurred. It's interesting how the Unsolved Mystery segment specifically referred to the conversation as a quote-unquote serious discussion, but stopped short of calling it an argument. Well, it's tempting to believe that Dave was telling the supervisor about all these unsafe conditions he had discovered at the plant and was threatening to go public, which soon led to him being killed, but for all we know, this could have just been an innocuous conversation which has no relevance to this case. And there's also the fact that this account was provided by an anonymous witness who declined to be interviewed on camera during the Unsolved Mystery segment and only shared this information with them over the phone. What's not clear to me is if this witness ever shared this information with police at the time Dave's death took place, or if this was the first time he ever told this story. It's possible that police already looked into this angle back in 1984 and found nothing suspicious. Let's also not forget that this is the same employee who claimed that he saw Dave walking towards Plant 4 at 5 a.m. If his story about Dave and the supervisor is unreliable, then that might also call this other sighting of Dave into question. If Dave never actually went to Plant 4 at 5 o'clock, then it isn't so implausible that he could have been working inside Plant 6 when he died at 5:15. The fact of the matter is that it doesn't sound like any evidence was ever uncovered to suggest Dave was a whistleblower, and I see no indication that he had any enemies or was known for making waves at his workplace. He was described by Harry Easterling as a quiet guy who did his job without causing any trouble, though if you were working under potentially unsafe conditions, he would not hesitate to mention it. But contrast Dave to Karen Silkwood, a union activist who was known for constantly raising issues about unsafe practices in her workplace and had reached out to the New York Times shortly before her fatal accident. I mean, I don't discount the possibility that Dave was a potential whistleblower who had been threatening to go public on his final shift before he was killed. However, no one from the plant has ever been mentioned as a possible suspect, aside from the supervisor, and that's based solely on him allegedly having a conversation with Dave inside a truck with the windows rolled up. But let's look at the other odd discrepancies. The second piece of evidence to suggest there was something suspicious about Dave's death is the odd timeline surrounding his keys, as a set of keys were found inside the furnace, but Harry Easterling is certain that these keys were inside Dave's toolbox for a long period of time after Dave was killed. The last time Harry claimed he saw them was near the start of his next shift, which would have been approximately 19 to 20 hours later, and he says that after a supervisor took the keys, he never saw them again. So of course, this has led to speculation that someone intentionally tossed Dave's keys into the furnace to make it look like he was carrying them at the time he fell in. This sounds suspicious on the surface, but the more I think about it, what exactly would be the purpose of doing that? If the people who killed Dave wanted everyone to think his death was suicide or an accident, why not just leave his keys in the toolbox? It's not like creating the false impression that Dave was carrying his keys when he went into the furnace is a detail which makes the suicide or accident story seem more convincing. And isn't it possible that Dave simply carried two separate sets of keys around with him? The key to Dave's vehicle, along with what was believed to be a key to his residence, were among those found inside the furnace, but would Dave really want to keep these particular keys lying around in the open inside a toolbox all night? Wouldn't it be more logical for him to carry his personal keys around with him, or keep them inside his locker? I know Harry said that when the supervisor collected the keys from the toolbox, he never saw them again, but I get the impression these keys were used to open locks inside the plant, so there wouldn't be any reason to give them back to Dave's friends or family. I definitely think it's possible that this entire angle with the keys is nothing more than a red herring, which has no significance. Of course, the most bizarre clue in this case is the loop of stainless steel wire with the oddly connected circles found inside the molten liquid. All of the other items from the furnace could be confirmed as belonging to Dave, but there didn't seem to be much explanation to account for this wire, which is why some people believe that it was used to bind Dave. It sounds like it would have been very difficult to carry a body to the top of the furnace and physically toss it in there, which is why the aforementioned reenactment from the Unsolved Mysteries segment, where Dave was tied to a crane and lowered down into the furnace, might be an accurate representation of what happened. But once again, the theory that the wire was used to bind Dave's body is nothing more than speculation. Given that there was a gap in the furnace which seemed to be left open at all times, it's also possible that this wire could have wound up in there at an earlier time, prior to Dave's death, and has no connection to this case. Now, out of all the mysterious unexplained deaths presented on Unsolved Mysteries, I used to think that this was one of the most obvious cases of murder, but it's only after I sat down and examined this case as a whole that I started to have doubts. While it might be tempting to criticize the Hamilton County Sheriff's Department for how they handled the investigation, technically they are correct. There really is no hard evidence of foul play. Of course, there is also no hard evidence to suggest suicide or an accidental death either, but the authorities really didn't have a lot to work with here. That's not to say that I completely discount the idea of foul play, but it's possible that the idea of Dave Bocks being murdered only wound up gaining traction when the plant was implicated in a major scandal months later. The scandal's most compelling connection to Dave is the fact that a broken dust collector had been releasing large amounts of uranium into the air, and one of Dave's responsibilities was inspecting the dust collectors. But it sounds like this particular issue did not begin until September, months after Dave was dead, so we have no idea if he ever discovered anything out of the ordinary which led to him being killed. And it's important to note that these revelations about the plant's unsafe practices did not come out because some whistleblower decided to go public. Once they discovered the issue with the dust collector, the Department of Energy and NLO publicly reported it themselves, and around the same time, they also admitted that 3 local water wells had been contaminated with uranium since 1981. When you take this into account, murdering Dave Bocks because he may have had knowledge of these issues would have been completely pointless. While it's undeniable that the Department of Energy and NLO did some incredibly shady stuff over the years and recklessly endangered a lot of lives, the only source I've seen who's attempted to push forward the story that they intentionally orchestrated a conspiracy to kill one of the workers is DC Cole. And well, I don't think we're exactly talking a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist here. However, while I've become skeptical over the idea that Dave Bocks was murdered for being a whistleblower, that doesn't necessarily mean he could not have been killed by someone at the plant for other reasons. For all we know, it could have been some sort of personal dispute, and whoever was responsible panicked and disposed of Dave's body in the furnace. I've also seen the theory pushed forward that perhaps Dave legitimately did die in some sort of workplace accident, which was the result of unsafe conditions. Rather than deal with the potential legal fallout, they tossed Dave into the furnace and just hoped he wouldn't be found. But when you think about it, that's not a very logical course of action. While the molten liquid was an effective method for destroying evidence, it also wound up costing a host of other problems. Remember, once it became apparent that Dave might be in the furnace, they had to shut it down and wait 3 days before the molten liquid cooled down enough for them to search through it. That's several days in which the furnace could not be used for production purposes, which I can imagine would be a major blow for a plant which was barely receiving enough funding to remain operational. There's actually a commenter on the case's profile page on the Unsolved Mysteries website who made a very logical point. This facility had drums of hazardous waste just lying around, which no one had touched for decades, so wouldn't that be a more logical way to dispose of a dead body and ensure no one would find it? I don't know. If it wasn't for the fact that a major scandal rocked this plant in the years following Dave's death, it's possible this incident may have been completely forgotten about, and there wouldn't be as much suspicion that foul play had taken place. Overall, I do not believe Dave committed suicide, and I might be more inclined to believe his death was an accident if there was any reason for him to have been in Plant 6 at that particular time. While I certainly do not discount the possibility of him being murdered, I'd say I'm about 50-50 now between Dave's death being foul play and an accident, which is probably not something I would have believed several years ago. While this definitely ranks as one of Unsolved Mysteries' most memorable and well-produced segments, I can't help but think they exaggerated certain aspects of this story to make it seem more mysterious than it really was. All that being said, should you happen to have any information about the unexplained death of Dave Bocks to suggest that foul play did actually take place, please contact the appropriate authorities. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. We produced a bunch of exclusive bonus episodes for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3, and this past month, we released a new episode about the Frederick and Cedric Young case. As you might recall, this was featured as a final appeal segment on Unsolved Mysteries, and it was the crazy story of one twin brother potentially being sent to prison for a crime his sibling committed. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also released another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. So to learn more information, feel free to visit our Patreon page. I'd also like to take a moment to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Keith Z, Priscilla J, Johanna, Amelia, Izzy, Samuel, Alexa, Carlos, and Charlotte A. Thank you all so much for your support. I also just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit, as well as the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum, which contains some really interesting threads about today's case, which explore both the murder and accident theories. Need to provide a big thanks to McGill Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play Music, or Spotify. So have yourself a good week, and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.